Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Vincent Wall, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this live webinar, as you know, to present the key findings of the BDO Nursing Homes Ireland survey of the private and voluntary nursing homes for 2020 and 2021. Now, believe it or not, this is the 20th year of these surveys, 20 surveys since they first started in 2002. But I suppose there's particular interest this year in the main findings of the survey because they do reflect the full financial year 2020 of those nursing homes that participated in the survey. And as we all know, 2020 was the year when the first full impact, both financially, operationally, and of course emotionally, on the nursing home sector from COVID-19. So they will reflect that first year, that first traumatic year. And I suppose at a wider level, the importance of these surveys is not just the key insights they give us into the sector at a point in time, but of course the sequencing over time and the trends that we can follow over those 20 years of the issues affecting the sector. And I suppose, unfortunately, as we'll be highlighting later, those issues tend to be more challenging now for the sector in generally, not just because of the pandemic, but also because obviously of the increasing inflationary crisis and higher regulatory costs, and of course demographic pressures, as we discuss. Now, a quick word about the agenda over the next hour or so. In a moment, I'll hand you over to a man you all know well, and whom you can see on your screens there, Tig Daly, Chief Executive Officer of Nursing Homes Ireland. And Tig will formally welcome you to the webinar and perhaps give you some opening remarks, some broad overview of some of the issues as he sees them affecting the sector. Then it's over to Brian McHenry, Partner and Head of Advisory at BDO, to present the main findings of this year's survey. Brian has been involved over the last 20 years in each of these surveys, but he has asked me to stress that on the first occasion, he had just left secondary school. He's only a young fella. Following the presentation, which should take about 15 minutes or so, we'll open the webinar open to all your questions and queries. So get those in even as we speak, and particularly as the presentation prompts you to do so, on the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll get as many of them as possible to Tig and Brian over the hour. We plan to finish up no later than noon, so we'll see how it goes, but please participate, get your queries and questions into us, because it's an interactive seminar and that's where the value lies in it. Okay, no further ado, over to you, Tig.
Thank you, Vincent, and good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody, unfortunately, in a virtual world again, but I know I met many of you on Thursday at our members meeting. So I just want to, as I say, welcome you all to this morning's presentation of what is a very important element of our public affairs and representation in terms of Nursing Homes Ireland. We're pleased to have worked closely with Brian and colleagues in BDO again on the publication of the 20th survey. I haven't been around for them all, but I've seen a fair few of them, I can assure you. Again, just thanks to Shona, Jovan and colleagues in BDO and Brian, obviously. But also thank you to all our members right across the country who took, significant time to complete the questionnaire. It is time consuming. There's quite a bit of work goes into it, but the value of it will be seen this morning, and indeed when you receive the report in the coming days as to the information and trends that we will share with you. So hugely important thank you to you all for completing the survey. Look, I've been involved in nursing homes for almost 15 years now at this point in time, and the sector is a very resilient sector, characterized by strong people, committed people to care of the older person. But there's only so much any sector can take, and we continue to be tested as a sector. None more so, I suppose, than COVID in the last number of years. And as Vincent mentioned there, we're now in a time of unprecedented, and I do, that word is bandied around a lot in respect of many elements, but to say that we're an unprecedented is an understatement in terms of the inflationary pressures generally, but more particularly on the nursing home sector. So as I said, we have been tested, but there's only so much any sector can take. So at our members meeting on Thursday last, I met many of you, and I outlined, I suppose, our activities over the last number of months. Very, very positive indications from government. We were clear that they were listening and that a scheme of support in the medium term was imminent. Now, that hasn't been delivered to date, and that's hugely regrettable. But we're, confident, maybe is a strong word, but we're definitely hopeful that in the coming weeks we will be in a position to communicate to you in terms of maybe the more immediate issues. Today's survey report is hugely important because it does provide us with up-to-date, accurate information. As I said, that's hugely important for us as a strong, focused, representative organisation, because we do need the independence, obviously, but also the evidence base to better inform both our actions, but also the whole area of public policy. And to shape and influence public policy, we do need accurate data. The key messages are not new to us and not new to many people on this call this morning. We've known for quite some time there's significant pressure, but sometimes I suppose we have to have a crisis for people to act. And, you know, we've warned on many an occasion and highlighted on many an occasion the constant dripping, if you like, on fair deal rates and the constant pressure on the sector. We're now, in my mind, in a crisis. You know, it's not that there's an imminent crisis, we are in a crisis. And while all the focus is absolutely on the smaller homes, highlighted by ourselves and indeed by the independent regulator, HICWA, just in the last number of weeks, this is an issue, particularly the unprecedented inflation, that affects all nursing homes. So it's the medium, large and small nursing homes. And that's why it's important that we don't lose sight of the impact all of this is going to have on the wider nursing home sector. The trends are very, very worrying in this. But again, as I say, we are characterized by resilient people. And, you know, in HI, we take our responsibility seriously. We will be at the table ensuring that the voice of the sector is heard loud and clear, but also looking at solutions. You know, it's not just about cursing the darkness and saying, woe is us. Absolutely woe is us. But we are, as I say, resilient, and we are committed to finding solutions. And we'll be very active on that front in the coming days and weeks in respect of the immediate measures, but also in terms of the longer term. You've heard me speak before many an occasion on the issues of an aging population. Sometimes that's characterized as a problem. I don't see it as a problem, and indeed, I'm sure, as we said on many an occasion, who wants to live to be 100? The person who's 99. So we should be celebrating the fact that people are living longer. Absolutely, it's fantastic. My own mother is 90, my mother-in-law is 91, both living in their own homes. So we should be celebrating that fact, but putting in place a whole range of services to meet their needs and indeed our needs into the future. So I want to again just thank Vincent for hosting this morning, thank Brian and colleagues for their work to date. You will be receiving the copy of the report from Nursing Homes Ireland in the coming days, and I look forward to hearing your questions as the seminar goes on. And I look forward to hearing Brian's presentation, where he's going to outline in some detail the key messages and the information that has been shared by yourselves to shape and to inform this critical report at a very, very critical time in our sector. So good morning.
Thanks indeed, Ty, for those opening remarks, and we look forward to talking to you later in the session after the presentation, which you've just referenced there from Brian. So Brian, over to you for the presentation of the main results of the latest survey. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Vincent, and thank you, Ty, because you've mentioned one or two of my colleagues who've worked diligently on this over the last number of months, Shona Sheehan and Jovan Johnson. But equally, I'd like to mention the team in Nursing Homes Ireland who have worked as diligently, Liam, Michael, Paula, and indeed yourself, Ty, and the committee from Nursing Homes Ireland that interact with us. And that's very much appreciated, because it is a collaborative. It's 20 years. We're very proud of that association with Nursing Homes Ireland over that time period. And they do say that knowledge is power, and this is about analysing trends. We see some of these, and I'm going to touch on them here this morning, important trends. So in the first instance, if I go to our first slide, I'm going to give you some of the key numbers, and I'm going to talk into a little bit of detail. To set the scene, the financial statements and the data that you give to us is off of 2020 financial year end. However, in some other respects in our surveys every year, we put bang up to date information in terms of things like what's the actual supply of beds at a given date. And at this time, it's the start of June is the cutoff that we have used, June of 2022. And when we look at, for instance, the income rates from Fair Deal and others, it's at that time period. So if we look at the supply of nursing home beds as of the end of May, we are saying since the last survey, there have been no net increase in the number of nursing homes. There was 453 at the start of the year, and there were 453 at the end of the year. However, when you look a little bit behind it, there's been much talk in the last week about the number of nursing home closures and maybe they being used for alternative purposes. What we can show is that in 2020, there were 9 nursing home closures. Most of those nursing homes were smaller, more rural-based nursing homes, and I'll give you some of that data in a second. So it isn't a phenomenon that only happened since the crisis that has evolved in Ukraine. That's a worry to see that level of closure in nursing homes. And so overall, when we look at the supply of nursing home beds, it's about, just in the private and the voluntary sector, it's about 26,500. And then when you add the public sector, you actually see that the public beds reduced by over 500 in that since the last survey. Overall, there was a net reduction of 166 beds. The CSO data, which has been recently published, and when you combine that CSO data with OECD benchmarks, you would objectively say that Ireland will need about 45,000 beds by about 2031. So 45,000 beds by 2031, we currently have 31,700. It indicates very logically to you that we need an increase of about 1,500 or 1,600 beds per annum. What we actually saw in this most recent survey is a reduction. We saw a reduction of 166. That's worrying. And when we go into some of the regional analysis around that, we can see, for instance, that, well, if I give you, out of the 8 geographic areas that we analyze it into, 4 of them actually had a net reduction in the number of beds. So the west of Ireland, the supply fell by 4%. The southeast, supply fell by 1%. The Midwest, supply fell by 1%, while the Midlands, supply fell by 2%. So 4 regions out of the 8 saw supply declines. And that was, as I say, in 2020, before the current Ukrainian crisis. I would say that the analysis that we are doing would indicate a significant element of that falling out of supply is down to sheer economics. If we look at the most recent 12 months and see what has the NTPF increase been in terms of the fair deal, it's averaged about 3% over the last 12 months. In contrast, if you look at the consumer price index, for that same period, it's been about 9%. So there is a gap of about 6% between what is general price inflation and what has been the level of increase in the fair deal rate, which is being granted to operators. But of course, nursing homes in particular have got to be extremely vigilant around their temperatures inside the nursing homes with older, more vulnerable people. And so energy cost is a very big cost inside the nursing homes. And for most operators that we interact with, we can see that that has been 100% or more increase in that cost alone in the last 12 months. So we believe when we start to analyze the, maybe on the right-hand side of that slide, the number of older persons aged over 65 per bed, it has grown in the last period since our survey. So in the previous survey, the number of older persons it's gone up by about 7% of the over 65 population per nursing home bed within the period of one survey. And that's quite a stark number if you think about 48,000 additional people in Ireland over the age of 65 compared with our last survey. when you align that with the fact that there's actually been a reduction in the number of nursing home beds, it's not hard to see that you're going to see more older persons per available bed. And I believe that that is a trend which is going to prove problematic for all of the health services, including the hospital service, in the very near future, unless that issue of supply is going to be addressed. How do you address supply? Well, clearly, when we look at some of the regional areas and we see that 4 of the 8 regions have had actual bed decreases, it's clear that they're not being remunerated sufficiently. Many are going and deciding to close their business because it's just not economical to keep it open, or indeed maybe some of the capital expenditure challenges that they face are too great for them to warrant that investment. Heard the minister talking about this in recent times. I believe the cause of it is much more broadly based than these being put to alternative use, because, as I have said, in 2020, long before that crisis, there were 9 nursing homes in those same regions of the country, rural and smaller, that were closing their doors, and no doubt they're big employers in those areas, and that is a certain loss to the sector. I believe next year's survey is going to show that that trend is going to be much more problematic, because we have heard of an increasing volume of closures in recent times. So the correlation between the statistics on that slide are very logical. If you reduce the number of beds, or if they fall, if you have an increasing population overall in that cohort of persons in society, well, then logically you're going to have an increased number of persons in the per bed supplied in the over 65 population. I will give you one stark figure. If you, for instance, take Donegal as a county, the fair deal rate in that county is the lowest in the country. It's €955 on average. There's over 40 persons aged over 65 per nursing home bed in Donegal, compared to the national average of 28.9. It really does, I think, very tangibly show the correlation between not being able to build new nursing homes because you can't financially justify it, and the fact that the population per bed is higher than in other areas. And when I look at and you will be able to see it when you get the survey, when you look at the counties which have higher than the average number of older persons per bed, you will see that they're in areas where the fair deal rates are not sufficiently strong. And I think that is a really telling finding of this year's survey. And it's going to be a real problem for society and for the hospital system if that is not addressed in the short term. Because like all of things, we see it in housing. You can't turn on the supply of nursing homes and expect it to happen in 6 months or 9 months. They take a number of years in terms of planning to come through and to be brought to fruition. So maybe if I could talk about the next slide, so please. Going to address the issue of occupancy in the sector. And the 2020 occupancy, by comparison with the previous year, was a little disappointing. And we started to try and analyze why occupancy fell by about 1.2% vis-a-vis the previous year. In some respects, we were surprised, and in others, we maybe weren't. We believe it reflects the impact of COVID, which clearly led to a reduction in bed capacity available due to infection prevention control measures. All of our analysis would say, we believe that lower occupancy trend will change post-COVID. And why do we say that? Well, we say it for 2 reasons. Number one, the fact that supply has actually reduced and is not keeping track with what is projected as the need for nursing home beds. And secondly, the the older population is increasing. So we believe, and we would be very surprised if the trend in future surveys in a post-COVID environment is that occupancy doesn't start to creep back up again. But it was 1.2% lower in 2020. That in itself would have put some financial pressure on nursing homes during the period. If we look then at the average weekly rate across the country, and this is as of May, the end of May 2022, the average weekly rate for all nursing homes across the country was €1,057 per resident per week. That, of course, varies from, as I have said, a low of €955 in Donegal to a high of €1,235 in Dublin. I think it's worth noting that there are 14 counties on a rate of less than €1,000 per resident per week. And that is very, very difficult for nursing home operators on that level of income to be able to, number one, ensure operational excellence, and number two, to ensure that they can put money back into their facilities. Or indeed, like in my own county of Limerick, where in the last 12 months, we've given 2 negative feasibility reports on the ability to build a greenfield nursing home. And that's what it translates to. We tell clients when we analyze the numbers that unless they can bring almost half of the required investment in equity, the nursing home development is not justifiable and sustainable. So that regional variability is something of a challenge, because when we start analyzing that with the other metrics, we can clearly see that that shortage is as a consequence of the lack of revenues being generated in those areas. So then maybe if I go to our next slide, we talk about staff costs and dependency levels. Well, staff costs they turned out to be 60.9% of turnover in the year in question. That is broadly in line with previous surveys. So effectively €6.10 out of every €10 earned is going directly on staff costs. It does vary. We have all of the regional analysis inside in the survey. And so, for instance, you would expect that percentage to be higher in counties where the fair deal rate is lower, and that is indeed the case. So if we look at areas like the Midlands, the West, the Northwest, they're in percentages which are 63, 64, and indeed in the Midlands up to 68%. Whereas in some of the Dublin regions, we're seeing that the average in those areas, for instance, in Dublin North and in others, we're seeing that that average is down to about 56%. Why? Because I think 2 reasons. One is that the fair deal rate is higher, and probably also because the size of nursing homes in the urban areas of Dublin are higher, and so therefore you're also beginning to get the economies of scale. So we see that range going from about 56% up to 68%, but on average coming out at just under 61% on a national basis. And to talk about dependency for a second then, dependency levels have increased. And that's been a trend that has been visible since the very first survey that we conducted in 2002. There are now 55% of residents in nursing homes are maximum or high dependency. And that number continues to rise. And when you add in the medium dependency level, you're up to almost 8.5 of 10 residents are in those 3 categories. a smaller cohort of residents inside nursing homes on an annual basis are what we would consider to be social care cases, or residents inside that for social reasons. The dependency mix in nursing homes continues to increase, and that leads to a level of care hours per resident per day. It is unrecognizable. When we, on the 20th anniversary of the first survey, we can reveal that the level of care hours per resident per day has gone up by almost 50% over that time period. It's now at about a level of 3.7 care hours. It does show that back in 2002, when the first survey was done, the level of dependency was much lower. The level of independence of residents in nursing homes was higher, and that's not the case today. And as a consequence, the volume of staffing that we see inside the nursing homes is up with what we would have considered, and from all of the research that we have done with the Royal College of Nursing and others, that this is the appropriate level of staffing for care of residents, frail elderly and residents with dementia. And that number is being relatively consistent over the last couple of years at about 3.7 care hours per resident per day. So that is maybe some of the highlights of this year's survey. There's a lot of regional analysis that's available inside it. We would again like to thank you, the members, the operators out in the market, for providing us with this information, because it is very, very valuable. It allows us to outline to government and other key stakeholders some of the challenges and some of the policy areas that they should be focusing on. And I look forward to doing the questions and answers session with Tig, and I will hand back to you now, Vincent.
Thanks indeed, Brian, for that very comprehensive analysis of the main findings of the latest survey. And I see your questions are beginning to come in already, so thank you for those, and please keep them coming. Before we come to some of the questions from the attendees, Brian and Tig, and I think you both might want to respond to this, but I might come to you first, Brian. You know, the surveys, not just this one, but the previous ones, show that some of these trends have been happening for the last 2 or 3 years, perhaps pre-pandemic, certainly pre the Ukrainian crisis, of particularly smaller nursing homes closing. Do you think that that's going to accelerate over the next year or so? I think we all heard Claire McNally of Stella Maris from Athlone on the radio last week, to which Tig responded. Just the sheer increase in energy prices, and nursing homes have no discretion as to how they consume that energy. Just the sheer increase in energy prices alone will accelerate an existing trend.
Well, I think, and no doubt Tig will be able to talk about his members' sentiments in this regard as well, but my sense is that, yes, Vincent, I believe this trend will continue. And I say this for a few reasons. Firstly, we've been involved in advising in this sector since about 1996. And when I first started then, at that time, many of the operators were in their 40s. And now some 25 years later, they're coming to retirement age, or indeed in many instances are beyond what would be considered the normal retirement age. And unless there's a clear succession and an attractive succession, well, then it won't succeed. The business will not transfer. And we're seeing a lot of businesses that are not transferring. And that's a sad thing. So for instance, there's a lot of operators who are saying, I'm approaching 70 years of age. The next generation of my family do not want to go into nursing. They found it a difficult 24-hour, 7-day-a-week business. I will say that many have decided after the difficult period of COVID that they said, it's time is up, it's enough. And maybe in some instances, they're facing requirements for further capital investment, and they're around infection prevention control or further separation. Mind you, our survey, Vincent, will say that the sector has completely responded to the requirement for the composition of beds, with 80% the requirement that 8 out of 10 new beds would be in the form of singles at least. And the sector is compliant with that. 82% of the bed stock in the sector are single, and so that helps with infection prevention control. But we see, number one, the single standalone operator probably is getting to an age where they need to be able to see succession. Number two, it's not deemed to be a sufficiently attractive sector in which to transition to the next generation. And so with what we're seeing in this crisis, I think it will be the catalyst, and we've seen it. We've seen, and we've heard the minister talk about 8 closing in a period of 3 months only recently. That's a real worry. That's a problem brewing for the whole of the health sector, in my opinion.
And just I know I asked you to contribute there, but on top of those longer term structural issues, the energy crisis, the inflationary crisis must be a real worry for people who are already beginning to wonder, have they a future? Is it? And secondly, what sort of short-term help from the government are you looking for within that context?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of elements here. I mean, clearly, you know, some people decide to leave the business, as it were, but they do so with a heavy heart. But what we're seeing in the last number of years, and more recently in the last number of weeks, is being forced into that position. They don't have any option. So there is that sense there at the moment that there isn't a future for many nursing home providers, small, medium, and large, I might add, because, you know, sometimes we can get overly focused on the small, which is critically important, but it's going to be the medium tomorrow, and it'll be the larger ones next week if we don't stem the tide. I mean, in the last number of days, I've been speaking with many people across government, and I suppose the point I'd make to them is that there needs to be an injection of confidence put back into the sector so that we can stabilize the sector in the short term and support those providers. So you're right. I mean, this is not news to us, unfortunately, but it has really been, I mean, I mentioned unprecedented earlier on. We wrote to the minister on the 29th of March saying this was a force majeure event in terms of energy in particular, but it's not confined to energy. I mean, it's energy, it's consumables, and it's also staffing. So we've had very good engagement with the minister, to be fair, as I mentioned at the outset, and we were expecting something to be announced, you know, a number of weeks ago at this point in time. I mean, at one stage, the conversation was around when would be the commencement date of such a scheme, and we were talking about, you know, 1st of July. The 1st of July has come and gone. So to answer your specific question, yeah, what we have done, we've worked with colleagues in Brinson Lawler, and they've produced a report for us as well at the time, which outlined the most immediate cost pressures. And again, that's historic, because speaking to members, they're saying they're looking at bills now that have been, you know, double and triple in terms of energy. But in terms of forecasting out what's to come, it's going to be even higher again, probably. So the figure we in our submission to government, at their request, I might add, was that we requested an immediate, across-the-board increase in the fair deal rate of 69 euros per resident per week. Now, that has been overtaken, I would suggest, by events. So we're looking forward to engagement, ideally this week and next, because clearly, as I said a few moments ago, we do need to put confidence back into the system, stabilize the existing operators. But there's two issues at play here. There's an immediate piece, but there's also a medium and longer term piece around care of our increasingly older and more complex demographic.
And I might come to that just a little later, but just to go to some of the specific questions, and I think some of them are probably directed at you in terms of some of the technical aspects of the survey, Brian. We have a question here: will we be able to see a breakdown of costs on a per room basis instead of a percentage of turnover?
We have, so we do have both absolute and percentage figures inside for nursing homes, as well as we have it on a geographic basis. So what we do, for instance, is we would say that the average revenue for a nursing home bed in a particular area may be, for instance, 55,000, and then we would be saying in that area the repairs and maintenance or the food costs or etc. is, we have both absolutes and percentages inside. So I believe between a combination of the two, interested parties will be able to get a pretty good understanding. And that is a good feature of the nursing home surveys, because it does act as a good benchmark for nursing home operators to be able to say, well, how am I performing against my peers regionally and indeed nationally? And we also do an analysis of nursing homes by size, because as you can imagine, that would show in some respects that you get the benefit of economies of scale as well. So we slice and dice it in a pretty wide way to try and help operators gain an understanding of how they're doing versus their peers.
So well worth going right through the survey.
I believe so. I believe so. In actual fact, once you do start to go through it in various different forms, you can begin to almost say, well, this is a comparable set of circumstances to my home.
Yeah, so very helpful. So I suppose one of the key messages coming out is that, we have an increasingly older population. I'm getting there myself, over 65, and that the number of beds per over 65 in nursing homes throughout the country is dropping. But we have a question here as to why, I suppose, plus 65 is the threshold that we measure for elderly or old age dependency, 75.
And I do understand that. I will be able to give you some analysis around that. The reason we use the over 65 population is that the OECD use it. And so therefore, it's been traditionally a metric of, when I first of all started advising in this sector, when I left secondary school, the metric was about 5%. 5% of the over 65 population were deemed to require long-term care. That is down to around 4.1% currently. And so that's why we continue to use that metric. However, I can say to you that the biggest cohort or percentage of age of residents in nursing homes is between 86 and 90 years of age, 30.4%.
Wow.
Yeah. The next biggest cohort is between 76 and 85. So what we do in our analysis is we do 65 to 75, 75 to 76 to 85, and then we start looking at 5-year intervals. And so to tell you exactly, less than 18% of residents are under the age of 76 in nursing homes. So 82% are over the age of 76. And that gives you an idea of the profile of residents in nursing homes. And as Tig said, that is something to be celebrated, where the biggest cohort of residents are in that 5-year window of between 86 and 90 years of age at 30.4%.
And while it is to be celebrated, Brian, I suppose it also adds to the higher dependency ratio.
It does.
Because just the way life is, those people have greater needs, and of course, dementia and other intellectual illnesses at that age as well.
No, that's right. I mean, interestingly as well, Vincent, it's a statistic that we like to analyze when we're looking at the sector. Which is the average length of stay. The average length of stay has increased in the respondents to this year's nursing home survey, and it's back up again over 3 years as the average length of stay in nursing homes as well. So that will tell you, even though the aging inside the nursing homes continues to rise, the length of stay has kind of bucked a trend over the last number of years and has gone back up in the most recent survey.
Another question here, which I suspect is for you as well, Brian, and again, maybe just a little bit of statistical confusion, which I'm sure you'll elucidate. Why does the HICWA elderly care home register say there are 560 homes, whereas your survey says 453?
453 private and voluntary. Then the HICWA obviously includes the public homes as well. We allude to the number of public beds in total, so it reduced, as we said, it reduced by 500. Many of those public sector nursing homes have been reducing the number of beds per home, but remaining open. So you'll see that there's quite a number of the public beds, and that's the reconciliation.
A question, I think, for you, Tig, and it's a very specific issue here, but it may relate to more than one nursing home. I negotiated a multi-year, 2 years in brackets, so 2-year increase with the NTPF last year before the impact of the war, inflation, etc. Can I renegotiate based on exceptional cost of living increases?
Yeah, and I mean, look, that's a hugely important question, because that exposes, if you like, the unfitness for purpose of the current scheme. Because what you have at the moment, all providers who have a deed of agreement are effectively in contract to a defined period. And currently there is no express mechanism there for renegotiating. So that's why we in Nursing Homes Ireland have been so active and engaged in terms of getting agreement from government that it should be an across the board increase for all providers. And we did have a seminar of our own members last week, and that was one of the questions that came up. And I know that some people are taking the opportunity to communicate that with the NTPF, but the short answer is regrettably absolutely no at the moment, because you have a deed of agreement. But I think it's important that providers would communicate with their respective account manager, outlining the challenges they have. But what we're trying to do ultimately is ensure that the measures that will be hopefully announced by government soon would be appropriate and provided, as it were, to all providers across the country.
I think that response is pertinent to another question we got in. In fact, the first one we got in, is it advisable to look to renegotiate fair deal prices prior to renewal date if that's a long way off? I think that's kind of linked, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, clearly what we're seeing, and I suppose, is that, you know, people are being driven in this case to closure as a result of being unviable. So clearly, if providers are in that position, you know, I mean, I can't advise them obviously on the micro elements, but what I would say to them is that we need to explore all options. And there is an awareness now within government that there are potentially further closures coming if they don't take action. So I mean, my advice to people would be absolutely to engage with the funder at this point in time, outlining the particular set of circumstances that they have, and ensuring that, you know, we can, as I said a few moments ago, ideally stem the tide in the medium term, because this is sticking plaster stuff in some respects. So that's why we need to look at the medium term, or the short term rather, or the immediate, and also the more medium and longer term.
Vincent, I would advise in response to that question, I would advise operators to engage as early as possible in relation to a renegotiation. So the pack is sent out to them a couple of months in advance of the expiry of their current fair deal deed with the National Treatment Purchase Fund. I would encourage them to be ready to have that negotiation, and indeed to interact with the National Treatment Purchase Fund well in advance of the expiry date, for the following reason. If you don't get to a negotiated position by the expiry of the deed, the NTPF will roll over, and they'll typically say, we'll extend a 3-month, up to a 3-month rollover, or indeed maybe 1 month in some instances. And if you have a number of those, all of a sudden you can have 6 months gone and you have no adjustment. And in an environment when inflationary pressures are running at the level, you can't afford as an operator to not be ready to negotiate with the NTPF negotiators in advance of the expiry of your deed. So I'd say early engagement is very advisable.
Good advice indeed, Brian. I suppose to the broader issue of the fair deal process itself, Ty, you know, you mentioned that this funding that you're expecting from government in the coming weeks is going to be a sticking plaster solution to very immediate funding problems. But the fair deal process itself, I mean, an amazing 96% of respondents say they're not happy. They don't think the methodology of the fair deal process is fair or set up to cover operational expenses. And we see that the number of patients or clients in nursing homes, depending on fair deal, rising all the time. What are the key structural issues that need to be addressed there from your perspective and from your members' perspective?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Vincent. I mean, ultimately, the fair deal, as people know, commenced in 2009, and there's been 3 reviews of fair deal. There's been a value for money report, and they're all saying the same thing. Is they're saying that there needs to be a more sophisticated model of funding, which is around the true cost of care, and that also addresses the dependency, because what you have at the moment is the sector is a price taker. The fee is set by government with very little recognition of the costs. I mean, Brian mentioned there that the increase in the fair deal over the last on the last year was of the order of less than 3%. We've been tracking this obviously all the way through. Over the last number of years, it's been of the order of 1.5%, whereas inflation is running at the moment 9%. So clearly, I mean, from the resident point of view, the fair deal, it works, I suppose, if you like, in terms of there's visibility of how much they contribute themselves. But from the operators of nursing homes and the providers of care, it is very badly broken. So it needs to be a sophisticated model of funding which looks at the cost of care. There needs to be an inbuilt independent appeal process, for example, an independent review, because at the moment what you're told is pretty much take it or leave it in terms of the rate. So, and it's not going to take that much in terms of tweaks, if you like, to the scheme, but it will ultimately mean additional funding. I mean, what we haven't mentioned today is that the state effectively knows what it costs to provide high quality care to older people. It's €1,000 per day in an acute hospital. It's €1,600 per week on average in the public system. And Brian showed the figure earlier on, 1,057. So there's about a 60% differential. And why is that? That's there because the sector is being suppressed, and not alone our providers losing out, but also our staff. The staff who work in the nursing. I mean, what we have at the moment is we have an independent regulator and a national standards across all public, private, and voluntary. So everyone provides the same care, but you have a significant, and when you look at 62% on average underfunding of private and voluntary care, unfortunately what we're seeing is the fruits of that particular policy at the moment, with pressure on homes and regrettably and heartbreakingly closure of many homes.
And is there any commitment, longer term commitment from government to address those structural issues? And might it include higher funding from the assets that some patients have themselves?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that policy decision is a decision for government in terms of the co-contribution. It is a co-payment scheme, so I mean, that is an option obviously for government in terms of recouping what they pay. But I suppose what we've seen is unfortunately a reticence to make the appropriate changes to fair deal that their own reports talk about. I mean, some of the reports that I alluded to, if they were published by Nursing Homes Ireland, it would be called propaganda. But it's their own reports. It's Controller and Auditor General. It's the Department of Health themselves. Regrettably, what they've done on the most recent one is kicked it to touch again. They have said that there's a further review of pricing, which will take a 2-year period. So we're 1 year into that now. So there is that kind of high-level commitment, to answer your question, that within another year that they'll be reverting to the sector on a more longer-term review of the scheme. But all these things take time, and time isn't something that we have. Time isn't on our side now, given what we've seen over the last number of years and also the last number of weeks. So there is an urgency around it in terms of, I suppose, as I say, stabilising the immediate provision, but also stabilising it into the medium and long term.
Ryan, Ty talked about staff there, and I presume there's been a huge churn of staff, which is another issue, I presume, for nursing homes. But there's a question here: did the staff costs included in the survey include training? And if so, do you know what the percentage cost of training is?
Yeah, we do analyse the training as a part of it. I'll be able to go back to that person individually and give a snapshot of what it is across the country. It has been rising, and it has been rising for the very reason that you have mentioned. It varies per region. It varies from about 0.4% to about 0.6%, depending upon the size of the home again. But on average, I would say per staff member, per bed, it works out at about €250 per bed per annum. That's what the analysis would say to us. That has been rising, and it has been rising for the reason you've said, which is a higher level of turnover of staff. And if you've a lot of turnover because staff are leaving, well, then you've got to ensure that the new staffing coming in have got their infection prevention control training, their heavy lifting training, health and safety training, fire evacuation. So all of that is a recurring cost, and it grows, as you say, with the staff turnover. So about 250 euros per bed per annum.
That's pretty clear. And it's a chicken and egg situation in terms of the cost of training, in terms of trying to keep staff and make them more professional. You mentioned, I think, Brian, during your presentation, because we see, while there has been an overall increase in the number of planning permits going through, I think 25%, and some of that reflects the fact that very little happened during COVID, obviously. There's been a 40% reduction in some of the regions that are worst affected in terms of nursing home closures and the financial pressures. But you mentioned that, leave aside the number of nursing homes, smaller nursing homes in particular, that are closing, which is a huge issue. It obviously looks like there are fewer and fewer people in those regions where the costs are marginal getting into it, and that you may need up to 50% equity to do so.
Correct.
And where do banks come in here, and how attractive are banks to lend?
Well, that's yes, they're all interconnected. Those factors are very interconnected, Vincent. So you are right. This year we've put in a new section into the report, and as a firm, when we're doing a lot of analysis, we use a company called Building Info to get data on what is or is not happening in terms of planning, in terms of what is actually currently under development, etc. So we worked with our friends in Building Info, and we asked them to put a section into the report, and they have kindly done so. And it gives an analysis of what are the planning applications. It gives us analysis of the commencements of new developments. What it does show is a heavy concentration in the Dublin and Leinster area for new planning applications. And when you think of that, by comparison, 72% of applications, so 7 out of every 10 applications for new facilities are in the Leinster area and the Greater Dublin area particularly, whereas by contrast, only 28% of that is for the rest of Ireland, Connacht, Ulster, and Munster. And that, again, it goes back to the very same point, Vincent. It is that, if you like, the triangulation of evidence that we're going to see that imbalance. I genuinely believe, and we've looked at many sets of metrics for the Greater Dublin area as well, it isn't as if it's easy to justify investment when you in particular talk about maybe some of the land prices. We've seen the cost per bed in the Greater Dublin area go well in excess of 200,000 euros. If you're up at those kind of numbers, that rate of 1,235 won't justify that investment either, is the truth. So it's not just, but it's particularly acute in outside of the Leinster and the Greater Dublin area, because if you're on a rate of less than 1,000 euros, as 14 of the counties are in Ireland, I cannot see how you can justify building a new facility. The banks won't fund it. But what is happening in those regions, Vincent, is that if somebody is seeking to exit because they've come to retirement, they will sell their nursing home at less than the replacement value. And that's the truth of what we have seen. So we have seen that right across the country. If a nursing home had to be built and put in place today, it would be significantly higher than the going concern valuation. And I believe that that's an imbalance which is going to have to be rectified, because with some of the smaller nursing homes just falling out of supply, and with that aging population, if we don't start having new nursing homes in Limerick, in Galway, in Donegal, then we're going to face, I mean, Limerick as a university hospital is under continuing pressure, but we've seen no new nursing homes in Limerick over a number of years. That's the truth. Because
apart from the pressure that might put on hospitals, I mean, the social implications would be that older people would have to leave their community to go, if there is room, in the nursing homes on the other side of the country, which just isn't on time, is it? I assume.
Yeah, and that's the issue. And what we need is choice. We need choice for older people. We need a stable sector that continues to provide high quality care, and that is respected and valued for what it does. I suppose what I hear constantly from members is that there's a lack of respect for what the sector provides and a lack of value put on the sector. So we do need to, I suppose the current crisis in many respects shines a light on the sector again, and I suppose that presents opportunity. When you mentioned earlier on the Stella Maris article and speaking on Morning Ireland last week, I mean, on the Irish Times article, Anya spoke so eloquently about it's too late for them, but it may not be too late for others. And I think that was a key message.
Indeed, yeah. There's a question for you here, Tig. I'm just looking at the time, so we just have a couple of minutes left. And thank you very much for getting all your questions into us. There's one here for you, Tig. What about auxiliary service charge increases, which HICWA are objecting to, quoting the CPCC recommendations?
Well, I suppose we all know that there are significant, the deed of agreement effectively outlines a whole range of services that are not included in the fair deal fee. I mean, it's quite explicit, and everyone on this call, or most of them on this call, would see it. It says, fair deal covers bed and board, basic aids and appliances, nursing care appropriate to the individual, and laundry. And it then goes on to say, in very legalistic language, for the avoidance of doubt, the following services inter alia are not included. And that includes, or excludes rather, all of the therapies, specialized wheelchairs, newspapers, hairdressing. There's a whole myriad of services which are not included under the fair deal fee. So I mean, the question, I'm not sure why HICWA would be objecting to additional charges, because the additional charges are there for services provided. As long as it's agreed in the contract for care, which it is, we have a template contract for care which we provide to our members, which outlines those services. So agreement with the resident in terms of those services and agreement on the quantum of charge. So happy to chat obviously to any individual member, speak with any individual member rather, about those issues. But I mean, I think it's reported actually in the survey, the issue of the additional charges which occur for services which are, as I say, specifically and expressly excluded under the fair deal.
I might put just one more question for you, Brian, here before I come back to Tig, maybe for just a couple of concluding remarks before, if you care to do that, Tig. And the question is, do you calculate what the average non-care hours are?
Well, almost by implication, we do, Vincent, but we don't explicitly call it out. What we do always put in is the care hours per resident, and that would include nursing, care assistants, activities staff that are spent with the resident, and that's what it's effectively. For instance, if there's carers who are particularly associated with feeding residents, that's included. So it's actual time with the resident. Then that clearly makes up the greatest cohort of wages and salaries inside any nursing home. Then if you deduct that against the 60.9%, it gives you almost the resulting figure, which is it's non-rostered time with the resident in effect. It may, of course, include time from the director of nursing, which is non-rostered. We would exclude that from care hours per resident because in most instances, the DON is not rostered on the floor, and if she's not, or if he's not, well, then we don't include that inside in the care hours per resident. So it is actually the time with the resident what we include. The rest of it, Vincent, is pretty much down to administration, maintenance, and as I say, non-rostered clinical input.
Thanks for those detailed responses, not just that one, Brian, but your detailed responses through the webinar. Really appreciate it, as I'm sure the people tuning in do as well. A couple of concluding remarks, maybe, Tig, before we wrap up.
Yeah, I suppose, look, again, just to thank everybody on the BDO side, but also in Nursing Homes Ireland, as Brian mentioned at the outset, for their input into this, and to thank members for compiling the questionnaire. I mean, we hear a lot of, I suppose, defining moments and unprecedented, but we are in a very, very challenging environment at this point in time. But we should, I suppose, be proud of what we do as a sector. We have and will continue to provide high quality care to people who require it, but we do need the acceptance of government ultimately as the funder of nursing home care to come and step up to the plate and collaborate with us in terms of the immediate, but also in terms of designing and resourcing a scheme and a sector that will last the test of time to meet that aging population. What I don't want, obviously, or anybody in Nursing Homes Ireland, or indeed on this call, is to be here in 1 year or, God forbid, 4 or 5 years' time saying, why didn't we act? Why didn't we act quicker? There is an opportunity to do so now, and we won't be found wanting in terms of our responsibilities, nor indeed will the providers across the country. So, the publication of the survey results this year is very, very timely. They're always obviously hugely important in terms of its messaging, but the timeliness of the messaging and the information and the data we have received from this survey is critical. I suppose it's now a duty on all of us collectively to ensure that message is heard loud and clear, and that we address those underlying challenges in the best interest of residents ultimately. That's what it's about. It's about the older person, your family and my family, and indeed ourselves into the future.
Absolutely, it touches every family in the country, doesn't it? Thanks indeed, Tig. And just to reiterate that Tig, Nursing Homes Ireland, will be circulating that report to all its members in the coming days. And I assume it will be available on the BDO website.
It will. Right? It will, Vincent. And in conclusion, I'd like to say, firstly, to thank you for doing an excellent job as compere once more. Secondly, to thank the 100 or so attendees on this webinar this morning. I would say in conclusion, I believe that there will be strong, high levels of demand for nursing home beds into the future. That's my sense because of the factors that I have outlined. The question is, will there be a similar level of supply? And that is the valid question that you have posed to us, Vincent, this morning. I believe the government has a number of levers that it can trigger. I think it needs to look much more urgently at some of the key policy areas that impact upon this sector, because if it doesn't, I am telling you, this survey and next year's survey are going to show a very worrying trend, and that is a reduction in supply, and that's that's going to be a real problem for our health services. They need to act, and that's the biggest single message out of this year's survey.
I don't think any reasonable person can disagree with that analysis, Brian. Thanks again to you and your colleagues. Thanks again, Tig. Thank you, everybody, for your interest, for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.